Welcome to Chapter 4, Data Processing and Handling under the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, DPDP Act 2023. In this chapter, we will explore various critical aspects of data processing, including lawful bases for processing personal data, how to handle sensitive and critical data, and the regulations surrounding cross-border data transfers. Let's delve into the details. Data processing and handling are central to the provisions of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, 2023, DPDP Act. This chapter explores various factors of places robust safeguards around the processing, storage, and retention of personal data to ensure lawful and secure handling, with special emphasis on sensitive and critical data categories. Stricter guidelines now govern the handling of sensitive personal data, including health and biometric information, ensuring explicit consent and enhanced security measures to protect individuals' privacy. Recent amendments to the DPDP Act introduce enhanced rules for managing sensitive data with a focus on protecting children and vulnerable individuals. Sensitive data. Under the DPDP Act, definition of sensitive personal data, Section 9. Sensitive data includes categories like health information, biometric data, and financial records. The Act mandates obtaining explicit consent from data principals for processing this data. Example, a health app collecting personal medical information for providing recommendations must secure explicit informed consent from the data principal or their guardian, if the individual is a minor. New guidelines for special categories of data. Children's data. The Act imposes stricter guidelines for protecting children's data. Beyond requiring parental consent, it prohibits misuse of children's data for purposes such as targeted advertising or profiling. Example, an online education platform must avoid collecting children's data for marketing purposes and ensure compliance with parental consent requirements. Persons with disabilities. Data processing for individuals with disabilities requires accessible mechanisms, allowing them to exercise their rights under the Act. Example, an online education service must provide alternative formats, e.g., screen reader-compatible consent forms for visually impaired users. Enhanced security measures for sensitive data. The Act emphasizes implementing advanced security measures to safeguard sensitive and special categories of data, including encryption and robust storage protocols. Example, financial institutions must encrypt sensitive data during transmission and ensure secure storage to protect against unauthorized access. Lawful bases for processing data. The DPDP Act mandates that personal data can only be processed under specific, lawful conditions. These conditions ensure that data processing is carried out fairly, transparently, and for legitimate purposes. Lawful bases as defined in the Act, Section 7. The most common lawful basis for processing personal data is consent, which must be explicit, informed, and voluntarily provided by the data principal. For example, a fitness app that collects health data from users to personalize workouts and track progress must obtain explicit consent from each user before processing their personal data. Other lawful bases for data processing include contractual necessity. This occurs when data processing is necessary to fulfill a contract. For example, an e-commerce platform processes customer data, such as name, address, and payment details, to fulfill an order. Legal obligation. Data processing required to comply with a legal duty. An example would be a bank processing customer information to meet Know Your Customer (KYC) regulations under Indian law. Vital interests. Data processing needed to protect the life of the data principal or another individual. For instance, medical emergency services might need to process a patient's health data to provide urgent care. The Act also permits public task and legitimate interests as lawful basis for processing, provided that the rights and freedoms of the data principal are not overridden by the interests of the data fiduciary. Conditions for lawful processing, Section 7. In addition to identifying the lawful basis, data fiduciaries must also meet certain conditions for lawful data processing. These include transparency. The data fiduciary must clearly inform the data principal about the reason their data is being processed in an understandable manner. For instance, a mobile app should explain why it collects location data for personalized recommendations and how it will be used. Data minimization. The data fiduciary should collect only the minimum necessary data required to fulfill the specific purpose. For example, a loyalty program should only collect names, contact information, and purchase history, not unnecessary personal details. Purpose limitation. Personal data should only be processed for the specified purpose for which it was collected. An online platform that collects personal information for account registration cannot use that data for marketing unless it obtains additional consent. Data collection, storage, and retention. The DPDP Act governs not only the collection but also the storage and retention of personal data. These data collection, Section 8. Data fiduciaries can only collect personal data for specific, legitimate purposes. This means that the data must be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. For instance, a customer loyalty program should collect only essential details, like contact information and purchase history, and avoid collecting irrelevant data such as personal preferences that are unnecessary for the program's functioning. Additionally, the quality of the data must be maintained. This means that data fiduciaries should ensure that the personal data they collect is accurate and up to date. For example, an online service that tracks shipping addresses should ensure that users' addresses are updated whenever changes occur to guarantee timely deliveries. Data storage, Section 8. Once collected, data must be securely stored. The DPDP Act requires data fiduciaries to implement technical and organizational measures to safeguard personal data. These measures could include encryption, access controls, and other security protocols to protect data from unauthorized access, alteration, or destruction. For example, a cloud storage provider must encrypt sensitive personal data such as financial details to ensure protection from potential breaches. Additionally, data minimization applies to storage. Personal data should not be retained for longer than necessary. Once it is no longer needed for the intended purpose, it must be securely deleted or anonymized. For example, an online payment service may retain transaction records for 7 years for audit and regulatory purposes, but must delete or anonymize the data once the retention period expires. Data retention, Section 8. The DPDP Act also establishes rules for data retention. Personal data must not be stored longer than necessary. Retention periods should align with legal obligations, contractual agreements, and legitimate business needs. For instance, a telecom provider may need to retain billing data for 5 years as required by regulatory guidelines. However, non-essential data, such as customer preferences, should be deleted earlier if no longer required for the business's core functions. In some cases, data retention periods may be extended, such as when financial institutions are legally required to retain certain records for extended periods due to anti-money laundering laws. Sensitive and critical data processing. Sensitive personal data requires heightened protection due to the risks it poses if misused. The DPDP Act imposes stricter requirements on sensitive data and critical data processing. Sensitive personal data, Section 9. Sensitive data includes information such as health data, biometric data, financial data, sexual orientation, religious beliefs. Due to the nature of this data, the DPDP Act requires explicit consent from the data principal for processing sensitive personal data unless another lawful basis applies. For example, a health app that collects personal medical data for providing health recommendations must obtain explicit consent from the user. Conditions for processing sensitive personal data. The processing of sensitive data should be limited to only those purposes that are strictly necessary. For example, a fitness app may only process health-related data to monitor users' fitness goals and should refrain from using the data for activities unrelated to fitness tracking, such as selling it to third-party advertisers. Critical data processing. Critical data refers to personal data that is deemed essential for national security, defense, or other data designated as critical by the government. The DPDP Act imposes additional restrictions on processing critical data, which may include specific security protocols or restrictions on cross-border transfers. For example, government agencies may process critical data related to national security under strict controls to ensure it is not misused or compromised. Cross-border data transfers. Cross-border data transfers refer to the transfer of personal data from one country to another. Given the global nature of data, the DPDP Act imposes regulations to ensure that personal data remains protected when transferred across jurisdictions. Restrictions on cross-border data transfers, Section 16. The Act permits personal data to be transferred internationally only under specific conditions. If a country has adequate data protection standards, the transfer is allowed. However, the Act empowers the central government to impose restrictions on transferring data to countries that do not meet these standards. For example, the personal data of Indian citizens may not be transferred to countries with weak data protection laws unless safeguards are implemented. Standard contractual clauses, SCCs. When there is no adequacy decision for a country, standard contractual clauses, SCCs, can be used to transfer data. These clauses legally bind the recipient of the data to provide an adequate level of protection for the data. For instance, a global company operating in multiple countries may use SCCs in its contracts with third-party vendors to ensure that personal data transferred from India is handled according to Indian privacy standards. Risks and safeguards in cross-border transfers. Cross-border data transfers pose several privacy risks, including unauthorized access and potential data breaches. To mitigate these risks, the DPDP Act requires data fiduciaries to implement additional safeguards such as encryption and access controls. For example, a multinational tech company may use strong encryption techniques to protect personal data during transfer across borders to ensure the integrity and confidentiality of the data. Conclusion and key takeaways. As we conclude Chapter 4, let's review the key takeaways. Lawful basis for processing. Personal data can only be processed for lawful purposes, such as explicit consent, contractual necessity, and legal obligations. Sensitive and critical data. Stricter rules apply to sensitive and critical data to ensure greater privacy and security. Cross-border data transfers. Personal data can only be transferred across borders under certain conditions, and appropriate safeguards must be in place to protect the data. In the next chapter, we will explore the rights of data principles, including their right to access, correction, and erasure of personal data under the DPDP Act. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining this session. In the next lesson, we will explore the Module 4, Compliance, Enforcement, and Penalties, diving deeper into how this vital code operates. See you soon. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more valuable legal insights and updates. youtube.com/prolegalminds. If you have any legal questions or need assistance, visit us at prolegalminds.com to connect with our expert team. We're here to help you navigate the complexities of the law with confidence. Stay informed, stay empowered. See you in the next session.